gentlemen, now we come to a very interesting presentation, and I was kind of looking forward to it. We live in a neighborhood where sanctions have been a reality. We've personally faced them when Pakistan became a nuclear power. And then, of course, Iran continues to battle with it. Afghanistan has its own fair share of problems. The kind of pressure it induces, not just your own economy and financial institutions, but also the region, is something that we have experienced firsthand. But recently, the world has seen a conflict, and the Europe seems to be very worried about mainly its energy supplies. And of course, the entire logistics of the region and global space have been affected. Of course, the morality of the issue is another area. You've been picking sides, but let's consider the impact of Russia-Ukraine conflict on the sanctioned regimes and also on financial crimes. Ladies and gentlemen, this presentation will be connecting with us virtually. We have none other than the Professor of Financial Crime at the School of Law and Politics at the Cardiff University. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Nicholas Ryder for this one. The presentation is titled as Impact of Russia-Ukraine Conflict on the Sanctioned Regimes.
Enjoying the conference so far. Firstly, thank you very much for giving me this very kind invitation to speak to you and to address you about a very important issue which obviously we're currently facing. My name is Professor Nick Ryder. I'm a professor in financial crime from Cardiff University, and I've been asked to give a presentation to you today that looks at the impact of the Russian-Ukraine conflict on the sanctions regime. Of course, the sanctions regime has a very long history. It's extremely controversial. The use of sanctions has formed a key part of what President George Bush described as the financial war on terrorism. Has been used against a variety of designated terrorist organizations, and more recently it's been used by several international bodies in relation to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So over the next sort of 20 minutes, I'm going to run through some information with you regarding what has happened, some of the very controversial measures, and try to look at the effectiveness of these. I've got to give you a very brief sort of link back to the funding entities. This work is financed by Innovate UK and Synologic, so I'm not going to bore you with that for too much long. So in relation to the abstracts, I'll be identifying how the association between Russia and Ukraine links into the use of the sanctions by the international community. The presentation will be principally divided into 5 particular parts. I'll look at the response of the United Nations, the maybe lack of response by the Financial Action Task Force, given its very controversial use of the grey list, and I'll expand upon that. Thirdly, I'll look at the European Union, and it will not surprise you that the response by the European Union has pretty much mirrored that of the Financial Action Task Force. I'll then move on to look at the US and the UK and try to offer some conclusions, if we possibly can, on what sanctions will we see in this year and how that will move into 2024. So in terms of a very brief recap on the conflicts, just to give by way of background, just to sort of give a little bit of context. Essentially what we have, I'll put my glasses back on so I can see the slides. Essentially what we have is the collapse of the pro-Russian government in 2014. We then have a new government is installed by the Ukrainian parliament, and obviously with the unidentified at the time military figures who of course surrounded key strategic areas within the Crimea and the peninsula between the Ukraine. And in March 2014 there was a declaration of independence by the assembly, and of course a subsequent referendum with Russia was held. So Russia has continued to control the Crimea, and they are supported by pro-Russian separatist forces. And sadly, of course, there's been ongoing conflict between the Russian separatists and the Ukrainian government, which has continued over that 8-year period. More recently, going back to last year, in sort of early November 2021, very well documented that the Russian military began to build up their forces along the Ukraine border. Russian forces were also deployed in its partner Belarus, and on the 24th of February last year, Russia launched what they classified as military action in Ukraine, with forces crossing into the border in the north, east, and south of the country. According to the Russian government, they were acting in self-defense and launched a special military operation in the Donbass region. And subsequently, Russia has officially recognized the independence of the Donetsk People's Republic and, of course, the Luhansk People Republic. And again, you can see both of those quotations are taken directly from the Kremlin website. So what has the response been by the international community? Unsurprisingly, the UN has adopted several resolutions condemning the invasion or military operation, as the Russians would argue. In March 2022, the UN adopted a resolution demanding the Russian Federation immediately ends illegal use of force in Ukraine, and of course the withdrawal of all troops. In October of last year, so roughly 4 months ago, the UN General Assembly condemned the Russian Federation's annexation of the 4 eastern Ukraine regions. Very important that the General Assembly UN has recommended that states independently should adopt sanctions against the Russian invasion. However, the actual legal basis for the use of sanctions, I suppose it is what's the word I'm looking for? The application of these sanctions will vary from state to state. And according to Mills last year, unsurprisingly, 7 nation states have imposed, some would argue, some very controversial sanctions on a broad range of individuals, companies linked into the Russian government following the invasion of Ukraine in last year. Now, the Financial Action Task Force, as you all know, was principally set up in February 1989. Its initial remit was designed to tackle money laundering with the publication of its 40 recommendations. Its remit was expanded following the Al-Qaeda terrorist attacks in America in September 2001 to include terrorism financing. So, of course, they became known as the 40+9 recommendations. The recommendations were codified, brought together in 2012, and have been subjected to, quite rightly, in my opinion, in terms of my research, there are some controversy regarding the application of the Financial Action Task Force standards. So, for example, we have the very controversial grey list, which, and if you look at the grey list, there appears to be a very much unfair divide between the north of the planet in terms of the West, North America, Western European countries, and a lot of the jurisdictions in the grey list are, of course, Southern Hemisphere, African continent, and the Middle East. So the Financial Action Task Force have adopted a very controversial strategy, where if a jurisdiction, in their opinion, has a deficient anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism financing regime, they will then be, of course, placed under increased monitoring. So the grey list, of course, jurisdictions are added, jurisdictions aren't added. But I think what's important to emphasize here is that the implementation of the recommendations will vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And to give you some contrasting examples, just to illustrate that point, in 2018, the UK was given the highest rating by the Financial Action Task Force in levels of its application of the recommendations. And recent research by UK scholars, American scholars, and a lot of UK parliamentary select committees has actually questioned the UK levels of compatibility with the FATF standards. So, for example, the Financial Action Task Force claims the UK has the best anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing regime in the world, but that's questionable. But of course, it's very unlikely that the UK will be placed on the grey list. So if you look at those on the grey list, those who aren't, it's a very controversial area. Will Russia be placed on the grey list? I doubt that very much. I know that there are calls from a variety of institutions. So to date, the Financial Action Task Force has issued several press releases, and the statement on this slide, the actions of the government of Russian Federation clearly counter the FATF core principles. And currently the Financial Action Task Force is reviewing Russia's role at the Financial Action Task Force, and it will consider what future steps are necessary to uphold those core values. And from my understanding, there is a new plenary meeting of the Financial Action Task Force at the end of February. So I think it will be intriguing to see what or if action the Financial Action Task Force does. The European Union has adopted a very similar strategy to the United Nations and the Financial Action Task Force. Very simply, the European Union, via the European Commission, has imposed a very wide range of sanctions. The sanctions have three particular objectives. It's to limit or to cripple, a strong word they used in the press release, Russia's ability to finance the military action. It's imposed clear economic and costs on Russia's political elite, who they claim are responsible for the invasion, and it seeks to diminish Russia's economic base. Interestingly, last October, the European Parliament declared that Russia, of course, in their opinion, is a state sponsor of terrorism. Whether or not the Americans will adopt a similar model, I will doubt very much, because the Americans do have a state-sponsored list of terrorism. It was open to interpretation to see what the Americans do, but I'd be very surprised. I've not heard anything in relation to that from relevant publications within the US to date. The UK has been at the forefront of imposing very harsh restrictions on Russia. So there are four principal aims of the UK's sanctions regime. Firstly, it's to put a large and lasting cost on Vladimir Putin and those close to him for the illegal invasion of Ukraine. Secondly, it seeks to cripple the Russia war machine and to ensure that Vladimir Putin and Russia loses the war. Thirdly, it seeks to maximize the influence on Vladimir Putin and Russia to convince him to end the brutal war. And then lastly, to illustrate to the world that the Russian government's actions have severe consequences. And again, that's taken directly from the UK government websites in the middle of last year. So you can see that there is a very strong rhetoric from the United Nations, the Financial Action Task Force, and also the UK relating to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of last year. The UK has implemented a very wide range of particular sanctions. So for instance, the UK sanctions regime is administered by the Office of Financial Sanctions under the HM Treasury. And they have implemented multiple sanctions against Russia, the first of which were in 2019, and they were classified as the financial trade sanctions. More recently, they've implemented what they classify as the Majinsky sanctions. This regime particularly seeks to target human rights sanctions abuses. Previously, they've also implemented the global anti-corruption sanctions regime that seeks to impose sanctions on jurisdictions, individuals, corporations, government entities which are involved in are heavily involved in corruption and bribery. They've also implemented a chemical weapons sanctions regime, and in the last 2 years, I think as we've seen multiple examples of this in the last 5 years in terms of cybercrime and cyber activists and cyber hacking, they've also implemented a cyber sanctions regime. So if we reflect on each of those 5 different types of sanction, you can see that the use of sanctions has become a common foreign policy by a wide range of nation states that seek to tackle what in their view would be a particular problem with international politics and obligations. So in relation to some specific information regarding the provisions from the UK, the British government would argue that the UK has imposed sanctions of approximately on 1,200 people and businesses since February 2022. And you can see from that slide that it's imposed sanctions on a wide range of banks. I'm conscious of time, so I'll try and skip through these very quickly. They sanctioned the defense coordinators in Russia, banned imports of Russian oil, and obviously stopped Russian aircraft from flying over UK lands. This is the primary piece of law that the British government has introduced, which is the Economic Crime Act, and the requirement imposes strict liability offences on UK companies and individuals that can link with the sanctions regime. This is some of the fines imposed by the Office of Financial Implementation. I appreciate in terms of time, so I'll skip through some of those. The US has implemented multiple presidential executive orders, imposed some fines. I had a little bit more time. Briefly, sanctions evasion. Some people have argued that Russia was attempting to work with the jurisdictions, companies, international companies, and cryptocurrencies. And what does the future hold? I think what we will see is growth of the shadow economy, increase of sanctions avoidance. Are sanctions viable to continue? And there will be a continuation of the international coalition. So my apologies for the rather rushed finish of that. And if anyone's got any questions, I'm more than happy to take them. Thank you.